I'm sure that when you hear that opening verse, it kind of jolts you, that God has saved me from the clutches of Herod and the plans of the Jews. I mean, it always kind of sounds, well, I don't know, anti-Semitic. That's not true at all. In fact is, I personally maintain that to use the word Jew as a translation in Scripture is anachronistic. It's inappropriate because it's out of time. The word in the Greek text is Judaios, which means a Judean. So you could just as well, and perhaps better translate it, he saved me from the clutches of Herod and the plans of the Judeans. You see, who we would call Jews at that time referred to themselves often as Hebrews. St. Paul speaks about himself as a Hebrew, the religion of the Hebrews, and perhaps anywhere between 5 and 10% of the inhabitants of the Roman Empire were members of this religion of the Hebrews. We would call them Jews, but again, I believe the word Jew is a very modern word. So, there were Galileans. They lived in the north. The Judeans lived in the south. There were Essenes, who were mostly from the tribe of Levi. They were Levites. They wouldn't have called themselves Judeans. There were people from the tribe of Benjamin, who sometimes, as St. Paul, he refers to himself as a member of the tribe of Benjamin, but then at another time he refers to himself as a Judean or a Jew. I suspect that the term Judean was a political term, as much as it was a religious term. It was not an ethnic term. There were factions within what we would call, as I said, the Jewish community. I think it's very important to understand this, to understand the New Testament. Now, the first part of that verse, you've noticed, and I notice people really are sort of singing. Is that just me? You're starting to sing more. Thank you. We're singing the Scriptures, and the verses that we're singing come from the Bible. And I really believe that in the context of Mass, God is speaking to us in all of the verses of Scripture that were offered. And the opening verse was that God has saved me from the clutches of Herod and the plans of these Judeans. I think it's very important to understand this in order to grasp the New Testament, especially the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, because they happen in an historical context. Herod the Great is a very, very important person in the Gospels. Herod the Great is the backdrop, the scenery against which the Gospels are played. You know, when you go to a play, you never think of the scenery, but the scenery really sets the tone for the play. And Herod was the backdrop. You need to know about Herod. Herod the Great was born, I think, about 73 years before Christ and died 4 AD. So he was the king at the time Jesus was born, the king of what we would now call Palestine and parts of Syria and Lebanon. And he was a dangerous man. He killed his own sons. You know the story in the Bible about Herod the Great killing the babies in Jerusalem. But he also killed his own sons because they thought that they were more important than Herod. They were descended from the Maccabees, who had been kings in Israel. And their mother was Mariamne, daughter of the Maccabees. And Herod was nobody from nowhere. Herod wasn't an aristocrat. Herod wasn't even Jewish. Herod was a political conniver who had always wound up on the right side of a fight. And finally, after the Roman civil wars, I'm sure you've all seen Cleopatra with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, all that mess. Herod's big patroness was Cleopatra. She was his mentor and backed him politically. And somehow he always wound up on the right side of the fight when it was over, even if he'd started on the wrong side. And finally, 40 years before Christ, Herod, after conniving and bribery and political maneuvering, was elected the king of Israel, the king of the Jews, by the Roman Senate. He was from an Arab family that had converted to Judaism a few generations before. He was the son of an Arab princess. Wasn't a drop of Jewish blood in the man. And the Jews resented that. Herod not only didn't have any Jewish ethnicity, Herod was essentially a Greek. This is what you have to understand about the New Testament. Like today, there was a world culture. Alexander the Great. Now, don't fall asleep. This is history. I know it's painful, but hang in there with me for just a minute yet. Alexander the Great, 300 years before Christ, had rampaged through the world and set up cities all throughout Europe and well, not Europe so much, but Africa and Asia. Many of them he called Alexandria. And these were outposts of Greek culture and language. And the Greek language became, well, the language of trade. You could speak Greek and be understood from India all the way to Spain. All across the ancient world, you could be understood if you knew Greek. Alexander the Great created a world culture. Greek was its language, and Greek culture was its assumption. We have a world culture today, don't we? We have a world culture today. You know, there's an Arab comedian I was watching on television the other day. He said he goes back home, visits his family, and there's this guy saying Americans this and Americans that. Of course, he's wearing a Michael Jordan T-shirt and a Cubs hat and blue jeans. Drive him around and say, "You hungry? You want something to eat?" Americans are, the source of all evil. We could go to McDonald's. This is in Amman, Jordan. We could go to McDonald's. We could go to Burger King. We could go to Kentucky Fried. And finally, his cousin says, "Listen, we're going to take McDonald's and Burger King and Kentucky Fried, and we'll go home." He says, leave Kentucky Fried, please. So, there's a world culture, and it's dominated by American popular culture. It was similar at the time of Christ, except the world culture was Greek. What Greeks thought was all right was, well, all right. And Herod was much more Greek than he was Arab or Jewish. He was Greek in his culture. He spoke Greek most probably. His grandchildren, who are the Herods we read about later in the Bible, were raised in the royal palace at Rome. They were taken to Rome as client hostages, and they were raised as good Roman noblemen. And they probably spoke Greek and Latin better than they did Aramaic, and then they would be sent home when they were adults to take over the leadership of the country from Grandpa Herod. Remember, he killed his sons. Well, that was the world in which Peter and Paul lived. That was the world in which Jesus taught. It had certain cultural assumptions. Now, Herod was a great builder. Herod loved to build. And he believed that he could put his stamp on the world by building. And he built for political reasons. When Herod was made king by the Romans, 40 years before Christ, the temple was a beat-up little old building that had been built 400 years ago after the Jews returned from exile. There was nothing special about it. Herod decided to make it something wonderful. He trained 10,000 priests and Levites as stonemasons and carpenters and builders, and they tore down the temple from the inside out because, of course, only a priest or Levite could go into the inner part of the temple.